There's a moment in every true crime story where you realize the tragedy wasn't inevitable. It was a choice. Someone chose violence. Someone chose cruelty. And in this case, that choice ended the life of a 32-year-old woman who was simply trying to build a better future for herself. Today, we're talking about Kristen Chavez, a paralegal from Houston, Texas. A woman who loved her dogs, who dreamed of becoming a lawyer, and who, according to the people who knew her best, was finally ready to walk away from a relationship that had been quietly destroying her. And that decision, the decision to leave, may have been the very thing that sealed her fate. This is her story, and it deserves to be told fully, carefully, and with the attention it warrants. Are you ready for the darkest stories Britain has to offer? Introducing our new book, Unreal True Crime, British edition. 35 shocking true murder cases that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Available now on Amazon in paperback and Kindle, or grab your instant PDF download from our website. Links are in the description below. Don't miss out. Get your copy today. And now, let's continue with today's case. Before we get into the details of what happened on March 12, 2025, I think it's important that we understand who Kristen was as a person. Because in cases like these, victims can sometimes get reduced to their circumstances, to the way they died rather than the way they lived. And Kristen was so much more than what happened to her on that Wednesday morning in Houston. Kristen Chavez was 32 years old. She worked as a paralegal, which, if you're not familiar with the legal field, means she was doing substantive legal work, drafting documents, conducting research, supporting attorneys, all while pursuing the larger dream of becoming a lawyer herself. That's not a small thing. That's someone who is driven, focused, and building towards something. Someone who has a plan. She lived in Houston's Oak Forest neighborhood, in a house on Emma Forest Street, with her husband, Chance Zane Chavez, who was 34, and she had 4 dogs that, by all accounts, she absolutely adored. Dogs have a way of telling you a lot about a person. The kind of care and love someone shows to animals often reflects the kind of heart they carry. And from everything her family and friends have said, Kristen poured genuine love into those animals. One of them, a 10-year-old dachshund named Peaches, was described as especially close to her, a little companion that had been part of her life for years. On the surface, Kristen's life might have looked relatively normal, married, employed, working toward her goals. But beneath the surface, according to prosecutors and her own family, something very different was happening inside that household. Prosecutor Steve Walsh, who handled this case, stated in court that there was a history of domestic violence in the Chavez marriage. Now, there were no formal charges on record before March 12th, which, if you've spent any time studying domestic violence cases, is unfortunately not unusual at all. Statistics consistently show that victims of domestic abuse often don't report incidents to police. They might minimize what's happening. They might fear retaliation. They might worry about what reporting will set in motion. Or they might simply be trying to manage a dangerous situation as safely as they know how, which sometimes means staying quiet. Kristen's family described the situation in heartbreaking terms. They said she was suffering in silence. They said the relationship was not healthy. And here's the part that becomes critically important as the story unfolds. Kristen's mother has said that Chance knew. He knew that Kristen was finally planning to leave him. Let me sit with that for a moment, because it matters enormously in the context of what happens next. When an abusive partner learns that their victim is planning to leave, the dynamics of the situation shift dramatically. Criminologists and domestic violence researchers have studied this extensively. The period when a victim decides to leave, or when their abuser becomes aware of that decision, is statistically one of the most dangerous times in an abusive relationship. The abuser's sense of control is threatened. And for someone who has built an entire dynamic around control, that threat can trigger extreme responses. Kristen was preparing for a new chapter of her life. She was done. She was ready to go. And the man she was trying to leave, according to her mother, was fully aware of that. Now we get to the day itself, and I want to walk through this carefully, because the timeline of events on March 12th tells us a great deal about what happened, and about the mindset of the person responsible. In the early hours of the morning, before most people in that neighborhood had even woken up, Chance Chavez did something that prosecutors later described as both premeditated and deeply cruel. He took Kristen's 4 dogs, all 4 of them, and he drove them to the Katy Freeway, and he left them there, on the side of the highway, in the dark. Think about what that act means for a moment. This wasn't impulsive. You don't accidentally drive 4 dogs to a highway and abandon them. That requires loading them up, driving them there, making the deliberate choice to leave them on a busy road where they are in immediate danger. One of those dogs was Peaches, a 10-year-old dachshund who had been Kristen's companion for years. Abandoning those animals wasn't just an act of cruelty toward the dogs. It was an act specifically designed to cause maximum pain to Kristen, to take from her the things she loved. It was targeted, it was calculated, and it happened before she was killed. That sequence is significant. Prosecutors characterize this act as part of the overall premeditated nature of what Chance did that morning. This wasn't a spontaneous explosion of violence. The events of March 12th began in the pre-dawn hours with a deliberate act of psychological cruelty, and they escalated from there. At approximately 7:20 in the morning, a neighbor in the Oak Forest area heard their doorbell. When they answered, they found Chance Chavez standing on their doorstep. He was covered in blood, on his arms, on his legs, on his clothing. He told the neighbor that something tragic had happened inside his house. The neighbor did the right thing. They called 911. Now, pause on this image for a second. A man walks to his neighbor's house, covered in blood, and says something tragic happened. Not, "My wife needs help." Not, "Please call an ambulance." Something tragic. That word choice, vague, passive, distancing, is worth noting. It describes an event, not a person in need of urgent help. It removes him from the agency of what occurred. The Houston Police Department responded to what was initially reported as a suspicious event at a residence on the 5100 block of Emma Forest Street. When officers arrived, they found Chance exactly as the neighbor described, bloodied, standing near the door. He was placed in a police unit immediately, hands up, and then officers went inside. What investigators found inside that bedroom was, by all accounts, a scene of extreme violence. Kristen Chavez was found unconscious in the master bedroom. Paramedics were called, but there was nothing they could do. She was pronounced dead at the scene. The cause of death was blunt force trauma, and the weapon used, according to what came out in the subsequent investigation and legal proceedings, was a clothes iron. Let that register. A household object, something that sits on a shelf or hangs in a closet, an iron. used as a weapon with enough force that, according to investigators, the iron was found near the body, broken in two, split apart. That tells you something devastating about the force that was applied. This wasn't a single strike. The iron breaking in two speaks to the sustained, extreme nature of the violence inflicted. There was additional evidence throughout the room that supported this. Multiple holes in the bedroom walls were documented by investigators. Damage consistent with a prolonged and violent struggle, or perhaps more accurately, a prolonged and violent attack. Because the question of whether this was a mutual altercation or a one-sided assault becomes relevant as you examine the totality of what occurred. Kristen had suffered severe blunt force trauma across her body. The severity and the nature of the injuries, combined with the physical evidence at the scene, the broken weapon, the wall damage, the blood, painted a picture for investigators of an attack that was both ferocious and extended in duration. The Houston Police Department and the Harris County District Attorney's Office took over from there. Chance Chavez was taken into custody at the scene. The evidence was substantial and immediate. He had been found covered in his wife's blood moments after her death at their home. But what elevated this case beyond a straightforward domestic homicide, if any domestic homicide can ever be called straightforward, was the context, the history, the dogs, the timing, the fact that Kristen had, according to her mother, told people she was planning to leave. In domestic violence cases, establishing context is everything, because individual incidents, viewed in isolation, can sometimes be mischaracterized. But when you look at the full picture, the history of abuse, the documented pattern of controlling behavior, the deliberate act of cruelty in the early morning hours, and then the fatal violence, a coherent and damning narrative emerges. Prosecutor Steve Walsh brought all of this forward when presenting the case to the court, the history of domestic violence that, while never resulting in formal charges, had reportedly been a feature of this marriage for some time. The knowledge that Chance had, that Kristen was done, that she was leaving, that his control over her was ending, and then what he did on the morning of March 12th. In the days after Kristen's murder, as the community began processing what had happened, something else was unfolding simultaneously. People were looking for her dogs. Friends of Kristen, local volunteers, and animal rescue networks mobilized quickly. Social media played a significant role. Information about the dogs spread rapidly, and people in the Houston area joined the search. The story of what had happened to those animals, abandoned on the side of a freeway in the pre-dawn hours, added a layer of outrage to the community's grief. 3 of the 4 dogs were recovered alive. That's a small mercy in a story that has very few of them. Peaches was not among the survivors. The 10-year-old dachshund, Kristen's most beloved companion, the dog her family spoke about with particular tenderness, was found dead. She had been placed inside a plastic bag and left on the side of the road. I want to be careful here because this detail is deeply upsetting, but I also think it's important not to look away from it because it is profoundly revealing about the nature of what Chance did that morning. The deliberate killing of a cherished pet and the disposal of her body in this manner wasn't incidental. It was part of a pattern of behavior designed to cause harm and exert control. It was targeted cruelty, and it occurred before Kristen herself was killed. The community's response to this detail was visceral. The loss of the dogs, and especially of Peaches, became a focal point of the public's emotional engagement with the case. And while that might seem disproportionate to some people, after all, a woman lost her life that morning, I think it reflects something important. The dogs represented Kristen's love, her vulnerability, the things she cared about. Destroying them was an act against her specifically, and people understood that. Chance Zane Chavez was formally charged with murder, and then began the process that so many families in cases like these find deeply frustrating. The legal machinery of the criminal justice system grinding forward at its own pace. An initial bail was set at $250,000. Kristen's family was not satisfied with this amount, and honestly, given the circumstances, the severity of the crime, the domestic violence history, the evidence at the scene, their concern was understandable. A $250,000 bail in a murder case, particularly one with these facts, struck many observers as insufficient. The family did what families increasingly do in situations like this. They turned to the public. A petition was launched, calling for the bail to be increased and for the case to receive the serious treatment they believed it deserved. That petition gathered more than 8,000 signatures, 8,000 people signing a petition for Kristen, 8,000 people saying, "This matters, her life mattered, this case matters." The response was a testament to how much this story resonated with people, particularly those familiar with the dynamics of domestic violence and the danger of the period when a victim tries to leave. When the bail hearing came before a judge, Chance Chavez initially refused to leave his cell to appear in court. Let me just say that again plainly. He refused to come out. It ultimately took specialized officers to physically bring him before the judge. As a piece of courtroom behavior, it's notable. Whether it reflects defiance, calculation, or something else is a matter of interpretation, but it is part of the record. The prosecution requested bail of $1 million. The judge set it at $500,000, double the original amount, though short of what prosecutors had asked for. Kristen's family continued to advocate and continued to make clear that they were watching this case closely and intended to see it through. As of the time of this recording, Chance Zane Chavez remains in custody awaiting trial. The case has not yet gone before a jury. I want to spend a few minutes on something that goes beyond the specifics of this case, because Kristen's family has been clear. They want her story to mean something. They want awareness. They want this to be more than a true crime story that people consume and move on from. So let's talk about what this case illustrates. Domestic violence fatalities don't come out of nowhere. In the vast majority of cases, there are warning signs. There is a history. There is a pattern. What's often missing is intervention. Either because victims don't feel safe coming forward, because the people around them don't recognize the signs, or because the systems in place don't respond effectively before it's too late. Kristen suffered in silence, according to her family. There were no prior formal charges, no police reports on record, but those closest to her knew. Her mother knew. The family knew the relationship was not healthy, and they knew that Kristen was finally taking steps to leave. The leaving phase is critical. Research on intimate partner violence consistently identifies this as one of the highest risk periods for victims. When a controlling or abusive partner perceives that their control is being lost, when they understand that the victim is genuinely leaving, the danger escalates significantly. This is why advocates and domestic violence professionals urge victims to have a safety plan in place when preparing to leave, not because leaving is wrong. Leaving is often the right and courageous choice, but because the act of leaving can trigger an extreme response from an abusive partner. In Kristen's case, according to her mother, Chance knew. He was aware that she was planning to go, and what happened on the morning of March 12, 2025, beginning with the deliberate cruelty of abandoning her dogs on a highway and ending with her death in their bedroom, may represent that escalation playing out in the most catastrophic way possible. The absence of prior formal charges is also worth addressing directly because it's something that comes up repeatedly in domestic violence cases. People sometimes ask, if there was a history of violence, why weren't there police reports? Why wasn't he arrested before this happened? These questions, while understandable, don't fully account for the reality of what victims face. Reporting an abusive partner to the police is an incredibly complicated decision. It can feel unsafe. It can feel like it will make things worse. Victims are often right that there will be retaliation. The system, as much as it has evolved, still doesn't fully protect people in these situations. And so many victims make the calculated decision not to report, not because nothing is happening, but because they are trying to navigate an already dangerous situation. Kristen was 32 years old. She was educated. She was working toward a professional career. She had plans and dreams and people who loved her. And none of that protected her from what happened, because domestic violence doesn't discriminate based on education or ambition or intelligence. It operates through control, isolation, fear, and escalation. And when that escalation reaches its endpoint, the results are devastating and irreversible. I want to close this out by returning to who Kristen was, rather than just what happened to her. She was 32 years old. She was a paralegal who wanted to be a lawyer. She was someone who loved animals with a fierce and tender dedication, who had 4 dogs she cared for, who had a 10-year-old dachshund named Peaches that she had spent a decade of her life with. She was a daughter whose mother described her as someone who suffered in silence, which tells you something about the kind of person Kristen was. Someone who carried her burdens quietly, who tried to manage difficult circumstances without burdening the people around her. Someone who was, in the end, trying to find her way out of a situation that had been slowly suffocating her. She was getting ready for something new, a new chapter, a life that was hers alone. She didn't get to have it. Her family is fighting for justice. They're fighting for a trial that fully accounts for what happened to Kristen, for a verdict that reflects the severity of what was done to her. And they're fighting for something larger than just their own grief. They want Kristen's story to create awareness. They want people to recognize the warning signs of abusive relationships. They want people to understand the danger that victims face when they try to leave. They want, if there is any meaning to be extracted from this loss, for it to save someone else. That's what families do when they lose someone to violence like this. They find a way to transform unspeakable grief into purpose. It doesn't make the loss smaller, nothing does. But it means that Kristen's name continues to be spoken, and that her story continues to do something in the world. The case of Kristen Chavez is still unfolding. Chant Zane Chavez is awaiting trial, and when that trial comes, the full picture of what happened in that household and on that morning will be presented before a jury. But some things are already clear. A woman lost her life at the hands of her husband. She was in the process of trying to leave a relationship that her family describes as abusive and unhealthy. The morning she was killed began with a deliberate act of cruelty designed to cause her pain. The abandonment of her beloved dogs on the side of a highway, including Peaches, who was later found dead. And it ended with her death in her own home, from injuries that speak to the extreme violence of the attack. 8,000 people signed a petition demanding that this case be taken seriously. 3 dogs came home. 1 did not. And Kristen Chavez, who had so many plans and so much left to do, is gone. Rest in peace, Kristen. If this story moved you, please share it, not just as a true crime case, but as a conversation about domestic violence, about the danger of leaving, and about the importance of listening when the people we love tell us, or show us, that something is wrong. Kristen's family wants her story to matter. Help them make sure it does.